the name of God Almighty, the most gracious, the most merciful. On behalf of Dr. Jamal Sanad Al-Suwaidi, Director General of the ECSSR, I would like to welcome you at the ECSSR, the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, where we meet today to listen to the seminar entitled Cybersecurity and Cyberwar, What Everyone Needs to Know, held by Dr. Peter Singer. He's a strategist at the New America Foundation and founder of Neologit, a technology advisory firm. He is considered one of the world's leading experts on changes in the 21st century warfare. He has advised groups that range from the US military to the Call of Duty video game franchise. He has been named by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, and mentioned by Foreign Policy magazine as a member of their top 100 global thinkers list of people whose ideas have most influenced the world in a given year. And he is the author of award-winning books, including Cybersecurity and Cyberwar and Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War. I call on Dr. Peter Singer to address his speech. You have the floor.
Thank you for the incredibly kind introduction, and also to the Center for hosting me here. This is just a great honor to be back, and I always appreciate the wonderful hospitality that they show to me and the other guests. And it's also an honor, I have to add on a personal level, to be on a stage as an author in front of so many books. It shows the value that's placed on research and knowledge, and it's just it's very special to be on a stage like this. And yet this topic is about a new way of communicating knowledge. And for myself, this first experience with this realm of computers began when I was 8 years old. And my father took me to a science center in North Carolina where I grew up. And I took a class on how to program a computer, essentially to train the computer and to train myself on how to communicate in this new language of computers. We used this incredible machine to do something even more incredible. Basically, at the age of 8, I programmed it to make a design out of the letter M that came together and then made a smiley face that then printed out on one of those old spool printers where you used to tear the paper off the edges of it. This was the world of computers when I was growing up. Today, the centrality of computers to my life, but all our lives, it's almost impossible to comprehend. We live in a world where over 40 trillion emails are sent a year. The first computer website was made in 1991. Today, there's more than 30 trillion websites out there. Moreover, the internet is not just about sending or compiling information online. It's also beginning to shape the physical world through what's known as the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything. The best way to think about this is by the raw numbers. Essentially, over the next 5 years, Cisco estimates that more than 40 billion devices will come online. Everything from smart cars to smart refrigerators to smart thermostats. Google paid $3.2 billion for a thermostat company. It's not about the thermostat, it's about Google then linking into the power grid and controlling the systems in your home. To again, over the next 5 years, inventions that literally haven't been yet made, all of them coming online. But go back to that number there, 40 billion. That means there's more machines than us. It means the machines, whether they're the smart car, the refrigerator, the thing that hasn't yet been invented, they're having conversations without us. They're making decisions without us. That's the importance of the Internet of Things. But again, whatever domain you care about, whether it's communications, whether it's commerce, whether it's conflict. 98% of US military communications go over the internet today. Whatever realm you care about, we truly have become dependent on this globalized network of networks. We truly are entering as what the chairman of Google called the new digital age. But this incredibly important and yet truly short history, just my lifetime, I would argue has reached a defining point. Just as the ripple effects of the cyber world have gone out with all sorts of positive consequences, we're also now starting to see the risk side of this equation. There's numbers that can drive this home. For example, every single second, 9 new pieces of what's known as malware, malevolent software, computer software that's designed to cause harm. Every single second, we're discovering 9 new pieces of this kind of software. Or on the targets, 97% of Fortune 500 companies, the 500 biggest companies in the world, 97% of them admit that they've been hacked. The other 3% have been too, they're just not willing to admit it. Same thing when it comes to small or medium-sized businesses. They did a survey in the United States of small and medium-sized businesses last year, and 70% of them had a cybersecurity incident in just the last year. To governmental concerns in the war sector. More than 100 governments, ranging from the United States to China to the UAE to recently Ecuador, have created some kind of cyber command, some kind of cybersecurity organization designed to fight and win wars in this space. To public attitudes and fears. They did a survey in the United States, and I think it's reflected in other nations, where they asked 3,000 American adults, what are you most afraid of? And they answered they were more afraid of cyber attack than they were of Iranian nuclear weapons, North Korean nuclear weapons, the rise of China, authoritarian Russia, climate change. Cyber attack scared them more. Now, these fears have coalesced into opportunity, into business. The cybersecurity business is one of the fastest growing businesses in the entire world. It's on pace to double in size over the next 5 years to reach $158 billion worth of revenue. I come from Washington, D.C., government capital, and we specialize in a different kind of business, government bureaucracy. And we're seeing the same kind of growth of government bureaucracy when it comes to cybersecurity on every single level, whether it's the local level. For example, Los Angeles city government recently created its own cybersecurity fusion center, all the way up to the federal government level. Again, in all sorts of different agencies, and we can measure it in lots of different ways. One illustration of this would be that the US military budget in 2012 used the word cyber 12 times. This year's Pentagon budget used the word cyber 147 times. That's the kind of growth that we're seeing in the spending in this. The bottom line is that for all the hope and promise of this so-called digital age, we're also experiencing, I would argue, not cyber security, but cyber insecurity. Now, speaking of insecurity, I can sense a little bit of insecurity among those of you in the audience, worried that I'm going to give an entire speech without visuals for you to look at. So I'll ask my friend over there at the computer desk to go ahead and start the program. Essentially what I'm going to show you while I'm speaking is a collection of how people have tried to depict visually cybersecurity. It's taken from government documents, think tank reports, private companies, and the like. And once it starts playing for us, essentially it will continue behind me. I'm not going to speak to it. And the reason for this is a couple of things. Go ahead and start if you can. The reason for this is a couple of things. One is it will show you the visual story of cyber insecurity. The second is, well, we're here in Abu Dhabi and you've created a wonderful collection of art that'll be at places like the New Guggenheim and the Louvre, and I think that I've created a good collection of art. It's just cybersecurity and cyberwar art. Now again, I warn you, art is in the eye of the beholder. So some you may like, some you may not like, but this is the way that artists around the world have tried to depict cybersecurity. Another reason I'll show you this is for you to look at something when you get tired of looking at me. But finally, there's actually a real reason. Studies show that you will retain 60% more of what I'm saying if you're looking at something at the same time. It doesn't have to be linked to what the person is saying. It's just the weird, wonderful way our human brains are programmed. And that's a reminder here that while this seems like a discussion of technology, it always comes back to the humans. It always comes back to the way the people are wired. So I hope you enjoy the visuals. Now, to pull back on all of this, as was mentioned, I wrote a book on cybersecurity and cyberwar. And I think the reason that I did so, now I'll pause here. This is, again, it's art. You have to decide whether you like it or not. This is how people think cyberwar may look like, with kittens and unicorns and the like. That's the artist's choice. Now, the point though, why write about this topic of cybersecurity and cyberwar? There's two quotes that I think illustrate where we stand right now. The first is from President Obama, who declared that cybersecurity risks pose, quote, the most serious economic and national security challenges of the 21st century. The second quote is from the former director of the CIA, who said, quote, rarely has something been so important and so talked about with less and less clarity and less apparent understanding, end quote. Now you can see this gap between the importance of the topic and the understanding of the topic in so many different ways, in so many different fields. And again, this can be illustrated with numbers. For example, they did a survey of business executives, and they found that 70% of them had made some kind of cybersecurity decision for their company, despite the fact that no major graduate program teaches cybersecurity as part of their normal management responsibilities. We see the same gap between responsibility and teaching in the schools we instruct our lawyers, our journalists, even our diplomats. For example, in the United States, our Foreign Service Institute that trains our diplomats, it teaches cybersecurity as part of an elective course on counterterrorism, a small module within it. And of course, cybersecurity is not something that just relates to terrorism. If you're a diplomat posted to Beijing, to Abu Dhabi, to Brazil, you might be wrestling with cybersecurity questions beyond just counterterrorism. The result is that cybersecurity is an issue that matters on so many different levels, and it may be unique in that way. It matters to you as an individual, the security of your bank account, the privacy of your family. It matters to you as an organizational leader, whether you lead a think tank, a military unit, or a business. Cybersecurity matters on the national level in terms of politics or even the geopolitical level. It matters on all of these different levels. It's very rare to find a topic that connects so many levels like that. And yet, it's been left as largely an issue for what I jokingly call the IT crowd, for the information technology specialists. The problem is that the technologists, the technical community, they understand the workings of the software and the hardware, but they don't deal well with the wetware, with the human side of things. They tend to look at the problem through a very particular lens, an engineering-focused lens, and often fail to appreciate the broader picture and dynamics that are going on. In turn, the people who specialize in the human side, be they social scientists, be they political leaders, be they business leaders, often don't deal well with the other part of it, with the hardware and the software. And the result are a number of dangers. Each of us, whatever role we play in life, as a leader of a nation, as a leader of a business or a think tank, as a leader of a family, we make decisions about cybersecurity that affect security in the real world, but we too often do so without the proper tools. Very basic terms and essential concepts that define not only what's possible, but also what's proper, issues of right and wrong. They're missed, or even worse, they're distorted. Cybersecurity is a strange topic where past myth, current reality, and future hype all weave together. Some threats are overblown and overreacted to, and other very real threats are ignored. Now, let me give you a little bit more detail of what I mean by this, of these challenges that we have in this place. One is how we frame the very threats themselves. Take the idea of a cyber attack. the lead US general for our US military cyber command, who is also the head of our national security agency, which is a very interesting phenomena to have an intelligence agency and a military organization that are very different yet led by the same individual. But that's what we do in this space because it's new. But the point is, he testified to our Congress, quote, "Every day, America's armed forces face millions of cyber attacks." That very same quote about daily millions of attacks is interesting, was said by the head of the Chinese military, except he was saying that it was millions of daily attacks coming from America against China. That very same depiction of millions of daily attacks was also said by the head of our Office of Personnel Management, which was the government agency in the United States that was recently breached and lost the data on 21 million Americans. The point is that everyone feels like they have millions of attacks coming at them. The problem, though, is to get these numbers of millions of attacks coming at you, we're combining all sorts of like and unlike things simply because they involve computers. Let me give an illustration here. When we're talking about the what of cyber attacks, we're bundling together all sorts of things because they involve the same technology. Now imagine we were thinking about a different kind of technology, a different kind of threat. We're worried about the threats to, say, the center. And we said we're doing a threat analysis, which a strategic studies program would do. We say we're worried about the threats to this center. We said, my goodness, outside in the streets, there are some pranksters with firecrackers. Or we're worried about outside in the streets, protesters with smoke bombs. Or we're worried about outside in the street, a robber with a rifle. Or we're worried about outside in the street, a terrorist with a roadside bomb. Outside in the street, we're worried about a spy trying to sneak their way in, James Bond with his Walter PPK pistol. We're worried outside in the street, an Iranian tank driving down the street. Now, we would, of course, if we were thinking about the threats, we would say these are very different things, very different actors with very different goals. But if we gave each of these actors a computer instead of using gunpowder in some way, we would lump them all together. That's what we do when we discuss cyber attacks. We lump very different actors with very different goals together simply because they're all using computers. That's how we generate these numbers. Or take the who, not the what of the attacks. I had a senior US military official argue with me that Al-Qaeda and Anonymous should be considered in the same category of threat. They differ in everything from their organizational structure, their membership, their goals, the tactics they use to carry out those goals. The only thing they share is that they are both non-state actors with an internet presence that begin with the letter A. That's not a good way to categorize things together. Or take the why of cyber attacks. They did a study and found of advanced persistent threat campaigns. These are the long-term cyber threat campaigns. Roughly 60% of them were cyber crime of some sort, attackers in search of financial gain. Roughly 25% of them were attackers in search of intellectual property, stealing secrets. Less than 1% of them were hacktivists, basically people carrying out political protests online. And yet, when the head of Homeland Security was describing cyber threats, they described the hacktivists, that less than 1%, as the, quote, exhibit A, the manifestation of the problem. The point that I'm getting at here is that we're seeing gaps in understanding of the various aspects of this threat, which means that we're not only seeing growing tension, but we're being taken advantage of. We're being taken advantage of at the individual level. So, for example, recently I received an email from my mother where she said she was in Thailand and I should send her my bank account information. I didn't know my mother was in Thailand, but I thought that was a very good idea to send bank account information to her. Now, of course, we think, you know, how could that never happen? Well, it's hit everything from 4-star generals to leaders at the G20 conference were recently spearphished by similar personal outreach, spearphishing campaigns. We're being taken advantage of at the organizational level, where we're alternatively not doing enough to protect ourselves. So for example, I mentioned that incident of our Office of Personnel Management in the US. It's basically the holder of computer records for government employees, including their classified information. It hired from China an IT subcontractor, which of course was the same state that attacked and took the information. So it was basically hiring people to defend it from the same organization that were coming after it. Or we alternatively are taken in by what I call cyber tricksters, cyber hucksters. Basically companies or people who promise us 100% cybersecurity if we just buy their product. Or frankly, I think we're being taken advantage of at the national and geopolitical level. I think this is behind a lot of the tensions around the global surveillance debate that was kicked off by Edward Snowden. This can even happen to a president. Reportedly, President Obama expressed his, quote, frustration that the complexity of the technology was overwhelming policymakers. Now, our inability to just have a good discussion about cybersecurity in terms of everything from the what to the who to the why is forcing us to have not just challenged conversations, but also a distortion of the threats and a misapplication of the resources in response to those threats. Again, I'd like to illustrate this with a number, 31,300. 31,300 is the number of magazine, newspaper, and academic journal articles that have focused on the phenomena of cyber terrorism. 0. That is the number of people who have been hurt or killed by an actual incident of cyber terrorism. For example, to give you a comparison, 0 people have been killed by cyber terrorism. In America, 24 people last year were killed by cows. So if we're doing a threat analysis between hackers and cows have been more deadly. Now let me be clear. I'm not saying that terrorists don't use the internet. Terrorists most definitely use the internet. And they've used it in particular. We've seen the rise of ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, whatever we want to call it. It's an organization that has thrived because of the internet. But they use it in ways that don't apply to this fear that we drive. I'm also not saying that there isn't a risk of cyber terrorism. Now let me be clear when I talk about the fear. There's a difference between using it as a means of communication and the actual act of terrorism. So to use a non-cyber parallel, if 2 terrorists send a letter to each other, we would not call that postal terrorism. If a terrorist sends a letter bomb, we would call that postal terrorism. It's the same idea, using it to communicate, to recruit, to gather information, versus using it to carry out an act that actually leads to violence, that leaves people hurt or killed. Now again, we haven't seen terrorist groups do that so far. It doesn't mean, though, there isn't a risk of that in the future. In fact, in the region we're in right now, we've seen evidence of potential future threats. Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a digital weapon, the first of its kind, where it was computer software, not a thing, that was able to cause physical damage to Iranian nuclear research. It pointed the way to the dangers that lie ahead. But again, the point is to distinguish between what's happened and what lies ahead, but also, and what many of the center's publications have wrestled with, is when you think about strategy, whether it is national strategy, whether it is your organizational strategy, or it's your personal strategy. Strategy is about identifying priorities and making choices. So we need to wrestle with what gets the most news, fears of cyber terrorism, cyber 9/11. That phrase, cyber 9/11, has been used over 500,000 times. Again, even though it hasn't actually happened. So let's balance those fears versus the other cyber threats that are real and have happened and arguably may be of greater consequence. So for example, right now, we are collectively the victim of the largest theft in all of human history. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the massive campaign of intellectual property theft, where you've seen secrets from businesses that range from oil companies and energy companies to defense companies to media companies to universities to think tanks, all targeted stealing their information, stealing their secrets, much of it emanating back to countries like China. This has enormous, not just economic security consequences, but also national security consequences. As an illustration, the United States and many of its allies right now are embarking on building a new jet fighter. It's called the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35. It's the most advanced, most expensive weapon system in all of human history. We're spending over $1 trillion on it. And yet, that program has been hacked on at least 3 separate occasions. Its design taken, and we were already seeing mimics of it being built. One would be called the J-31 in China. So it's a $1 trillion product that was designed to be 10 to 20 years ahead of its competitors that won't have that happen. We've seen the same phenomena happen in, for example, energy firm bidding, where companies would come together and one side would know what the other was going to bid because they'd already stolen their secrets. This has enormous consequences. But the problem, again, is to connect the risks and the threats to how we weigh them. And that then shapes what we're willing to do to prevent these threats from happening. So again, the numbers can illustrate the disconnect here. They did a survey of 500 business leaders, and they asked them, how do you think about the cost of a cyber attack? And they answered that basically, when they weighed the cost of a cyber attack, it was 2 things that mattered to them: how long they were offline and how much they had to pay specialists to come in and clean up the mess. That makes sense. But in that survey, only 39% of them said they thought about the cost of a cyber attack on their brand and reputation, even though now we're finding that 72% of the public will view an organization poorly if it gets hacked. So there's a disconnect there. Or, to go back to that example of IP, only 25% of the executives said when they weighed the cost of the attack, they worried about the loss of intellectual property, the costs of losing the secrets, not just cleaning up the mess. So with all these different issues and threats that are out there that range from cybercrime to, most recently, Operation Cleaver, which was the Iranian-linked hacking effort, what can we do about this? The last third of the book goes into the what can we do, and it plays out on every level, from, again, the individual level all the way up to the national security level. But I think there's 7 themes, 7 virtues that we can take in terms of dealing with cybersecurity and changing it from insecurity to security. The first theme is knowledge matters. It's absolutely vital that we demystify the cybersecurity realm if we ever want to get anything done in it. I remember speaking with a White House official, and he described in his words that cybersecurity was a, quote, domain for the nerds. The internet used to be a domain only for the nerds. Now we all depend on it. The security of the internet is also not just for the nerds anymore. It's not just for the engineers. It is for all of us, again, whether you are a business, political leader, military leader, or just the leader of the family. Second, that points to the theme of how people matter. Cybersecurity is a wicked problem area with all sorts of complexities and trade-offs. And the reason, again, is not because of the technology, it's because of the people. We come with all sorts of trade-offs, all sorts of complexities, particularly when we're organized into groups like bureaucracies. So if you want to understand both the cyber threat coming at you and the responses you need to make, don't just focus on what software there is or what malware there is. Focus on that important space between the chair and the keyboard, the people. Now, this people problem is not just about how we frame the issue, it's even becoming a human capital concern. Let me give you an illustration of this. In the United States, we have our Department of Homeland Security, which is ostensibly in charge of dealing with cybersecurity. In the year 2008, it had 40 people working full-time on cybersecurity. Since 2008, it's multiplied that number by 60. That is, it didn't add 60, it multiplied it by 60. And of course, it's still not enough. It's still growing. Take that growth that happened at that one government agency, Homeland Security, and repeat it in every single government agency, whether it is the military or the health services, and at every single level of government, at the federal level of government to the city level of government. Take that and repeat it at every corporation, whether it's an energy corporation or a technology corporation or a furniture company. And you quickly see you have an issue, a massive growth in the demand for cybersecurity talent, and the supply is not keeping up. In fact, there's a gap by most estimates that's roughly 2 million people. Not enough. Now, this issue, again, is not just about raw quantity, it's also about quality. They asked government hiring managers of the people that you actually hired in cybersecurity, how pleased were you with the quality of them? Only 40% were pleased. So they were only 40% pleased with the people they actually hired. Now, this issue, again, is not just about the IT department, not just about the technology specialists, because whatever realm you work in, whether it's human resources to operations to international relations to the military, you'll be dealing with cybersecurity questions. I remember speaking recently with our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the top US military leader in the US, and he talked about how an amazing percentage of his time was spent now on cybersecurity issues, even though it was not something that he'd been trained on. So the point is, everyone will be dealing with this. Now, this is a good news, bad news story with this gap between supply and demand. It's a good time to be someone who has the skills in this space because people will compete over you. It's a bad time to be competing over this limited pool. That then points to how we need to connect our security needs to our education needs, developing more programs that range from training to mentorship programs to draw in more and more individuals into this field and create a pipeline to fill that gap. This leads to the third issue, the third virtue. This gap between supply and demand, it's leading to lots of money for the people who work in it. Money is an incentive, and the lesson here is incentives matter. If you want to understand why something is or isn't happening in cybersecurity, focus not just on the technology, focus on the incentives, the costs, the rewards, the organizational culture. That's what drives this space. There is a reason why, for example, banks are so much better at their cybersecurity than, say, retail companies are or healthcare. It's because their incentives align. As an aside, healthcare organizations are actually the worst in the world at cybersecurity. I remember speaking with one specialist, and he said, if our banks regarded cybersecurity the way the healthcare sector does, I would stuff all my money in a mattress. Now, these incentives also point to the role that government should be playing in this space. Sometimes government needs to be a trusted information provider of cybersecurity. Other times, it has to change the incentives of organizations to get good at cybersecurity. Let me give an illustration. In this room right now, much like any other room, there is over that door right there a sign that is in green that says exit. The center put in that sign not just because they worried about us, but because they were required to do so for our security. We don't have similar parallels in cybersecurity designed to raise the level for all organizations. And again, this is not just in the UAE, it's in the United States as well. But there's also other ways to change the incentives. In our book, we talk about the idea that exercise is good for you. And by this, we mean not just physical exercise, but the idea of red teaming, of challenging your own organization, your own networks before the bad guy does. And the goal is not just to find your software weaknesses, it's to have the organization figuring out its responses to cyber threats before they happen. And again, not just for the IT department, but for all the other departments. And why does this matter? Well, let me give you an illustration. One of the largest companies in the world is Target, the department store that's based out of the United States. It was hacked. Now, the difference between the cost for Target being in millions of US dollars versus ultimately it cost them over $1 billion US dollars was not how their computer department, their IT department handled the situation. It was actually how their public affairs and legal department and board of advisors handled the situation. That's the challenge here, is again, not just framing it through these lenses. Now, these types of red teaming is also about finding the vulnerabilities in your organization, not just the technical vulnerabilities, but the human vulnerabilities. So a number of organizations do what's called phishing themselves. They basically try and trick their own people into doing things that are bad practice in cybersecurity. For example, they'll send an email around trying to trick them into clicking a link that they shouldn't. It's a very effective tool. But go back to the point about incentives. They handle it differently. One type of organization, they send the email, and if you click the link you shouldn't, it goes to a sign that says, shouldn't have done this. A second type of organization, if you click that link that you shouldn't have, it takes you to an automatic sign up for cybersecurity training. Say, you've just proven you are a threat to our own organization, you need to be trained. A third tier of organization, if you click the link 2 times after you've gone through training once, you're automatically fired because the organization has figured out you are a threat because of the way you operate. Now, the interesting question is, which organization do you think has the best cybersecurity? The one that has the harshest results for those that take bad action? Which one is hardest to implement because senior leaders are 3 times more likely to be the ones that click the links than people that are junior, and so senior leaders are less likely to set up automatic punishments for themselves. Now, this points to a fourth theme: mentality matters. We have to stop thinking about cybersecurity as a matter of defense, keep the bad guy out, or deterrence, I will scare the bad guy away, but instead make a mentality shift to what's known as resilience. Resilience is about accepting the idea that as long as we use the internet, there will be threats. And in fact, those threats will get in. In fact, those threats may already be on the inside. About 1/3 of attacks emanate with an insider, a current employee, a current member. We in the United States have experienced that, where some of our worst cybersecurity incidents were ones like the Snowden or Manning affair, people already on the inside. And so the point is that you have to accept that there are threats out there, and you won't be able to stop them all. You won't be able to scare them all away. Instead, resilience is about, how do I power through the threats? How do I get back up quickly when I've been knocked down? I'll give a physical parallel to illustrate that. Right now on my finger, there are tens of millions of attackers. Remember how we talked about tens of millions of hackers? There's tens of millions of attackers coming right at my finger. They're microbes. I have an incredible layer of defense against them, skin, keeping them out. But it's not enough. In fact, my body and your body has 10 times as many foreign organisms, foreign cells in it as you do human cells. But your body is incredibly resilient. It's figured out all sorts of different mechanisms to keep that from danger. Some of it steers them into areas where they can't do harm. Your stomach, for example, is a place where there's many of these foreign attackers gathered. It has internal monitoring systems to let you know when something abnormal is happening. That's like, for example, why you get a fever. It's your body's way of signaling that the attackers are making headway. It has a way of protecting what's more important versus what's less important. That's why you have a rib cage, to protect your most vital organs. It has measures that if you are breached, if you are cut, to seal that, to isolate it, to go after it. Your body has a system not merely of defense, but of resilience. We need that same kind of phenomena when we think about our approaches here. There's also a psychological side to resilience. Think about the way we talk about cyber threats, cyber 9/11, versus the British attitude towards terrorism. Keep calm and carry on. Which one incentivizes attackers to come after you? That you will overreact, or that you will keep calm and carry on? This leads to the fifth theme: communications matter. We've used the internet to share information on just about everything except the security of the internet. Businesses don't like to talk to other businesses about cybersecurity. In fact, a survey found that 46% of executives say their company doesn't share well with other like companies in cybersecurity, even when they have mutual threats. Businesses don't like to share information with government, and government doesn't like to share information with businesses. And government agencies don't like to share information with other government agencies in other nations. And so the problem is that none of us is getting smarter. The victim is getting smarter after the attack, but the broader ecosystem is not getting smarter because we're not sharing information well. And again, this issue of communication is not just about between organizations, it's within organizations. A separate study found that 1/3 of senior leaders had never spoken with their cybersecurity team, despite the importance of the topic. Another third had spoken with them, but they only did so on an annual basis. They only talked to them once a year. This leads to the sixth theme: history matters. We can learn from history, and not just internet history, but from other spaces. So if we're thinking about how we dealt with global crime and global piracy in the past, we went after areas of communication. We didn't just go after the individual actors, we went after the marketplaces. That's why we don't see the global level of piracy, for example, that we saw back in the 17 and 1800s. You don't have official harbors open to it the way there used to be. Similarly, when we look at public health, it wasn't just the role of individual doctors, it was the creation of public health institutions like the World Health Organization, or in the United States, the Center for Disease Control, that served as trusted information providers that proved crucial in stopping the spread of global disease. We need similar approaches in cybersecurity today. And that leads to the seventh and final theme. A famous American founding father, Benjamin Franklin, had a saying that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The idea that it is far more effective to spend on preventing the disease than treating the disease afterwards. He wrote this in the 1700s, and when the Centers for Disease Control did a study 200 years later, they found that he was right. It's far better to go after disease that way. He was also right for cybersecurity. This is a space that seems very complex, and the consequences are very high, and yet very simple preventative measures would go an incredibly long way. In fact, one study found that the simple control measures, what's known as cyber hygiene, would stop 94% of all cyber attacks. 94%. To use an American example, the most important foreign government penetration of classified US military networks, that is not from an insider, but a foreign government trying to sneak its way in, happened when a foreign government did what's known, their spy agency did what's known as a candy drop. They dropped a shiny object in the dirt of a parking lot. And just like a child unable to keep themselves from grabbing a piece of candy, in this case, a US military soldier saw the shiny object in the dirt, was curious, what is this shiny object? Picked it up. It was a memory stick. Curiosity again. I wonder what's on this memory stick. Walked it inside to their military base and plugged it into their classified computer. That's how US classified networks got hacked. The point, again, is that very simple measures would go an incredibly long way. Another great illustration of this would be passwords. What is the most popular password in the world? I heard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can do better than that. The second most popular password is password. This is not a great space to be in. Now, the point of cyber hygiene, and I think this is good to end on, is that it's not just about these very basic measures. It's also about an ethic of responsibility. I have 2 little boys, 2 sons, and I teach them hygiene. Things like, wash your hands, cover your mouth when you cough. But go back and think about those. Wash your hands, that protects you. But cover your mouth when you cough. That in no way, shape, or form protects you. It's all about you taking responsibility for protecting everyone else you come into contact with. We need that same sense of shared responsibility when it comes to cybersecurity. That's the only way that we will shift from viewing this as a realm of insecurity to actual cybersecurity. And so in closing, I want to again thank the Center for allowing me to come speak to you about this incredibly important topic that connects so many different levels, from strategic studies to your own personal finance, and also something that is, by its very definition, 21st century in its nature. So again, thank you very much for your kind hospitality.
شكرا للدكتور بيتر سينجر على هذه المحاضرة القيمة التي تناول.
Thank you, Dr. Singer. You have spoken about the importance of cybersecurity in our lives. Thank you very much. We open the floor for Q&A. Those who want to ask a question, kindly stand, introduce yourself, and be concise, so that we pave the opportunity for other attendees to participate. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Sam Kuo, working for Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation. I have three questions. The first one is can you elaborate a little bit more specific realm of vulnerability of the power grid and control the nuclear power plant? The second question is currently there's 104 nuclear power plant USA. Do you know any hacking happening in those power plants? And do you aware any of the worst consequences as a result of hacking? And the third question is, do you know any kind of specific preventive measure that can be implemented in a nuclear power plant operation? And is there any kind of a future research or technology advancement, both hardware and software, to have a hacker-free of the nuclear power plant operation? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question, and it's something on many people's concern. This scenario of the power grid being hacked is something that's been covered in everything from government documents to a number of entertainment world. It's a very much a trope of Hollywood. I can think of about 5 different movies that have had that scenario. Now, again, we need to put it into context. So the fear of the power grid going down, it may be, it was a plot of Die Hard movies with Bruce Willis, and it's something that government leaders that range from presidents to generals have all cited, and yet hackers have taken down power grids 0 times. In fact, in the United States, squirrels, the small rodent, have taken down hundreds of power grids. So if we're doing a threat measure, squirrels have been proven to be more dangerous than hackers. Now, sometimes people say, oh, but it's not just the threat of the power grid. They could take down global financial trading. Squirrels have shut down trading on Wall Street on 3 separate occasions. Hackers have done it 0 times. Now, my point is, again, not that squirrels are the true greater danger out there. It's that we need to put our worries, our concerns into context. And there is a real threat of getting into power grids, and even more so if you're worried about nuclear power systems. And then we need to put that in the context of what would happen if they were knocked offline. So essentially the way that you would, it would depend on everything from how much of the power grid is knocked offline to what's the prevailing weather, and that would shape the death toll. So either if it was incredibly hot or incredibly cold, the consequences would be worse. That's different when you move into things like a nuclear power scenario and or a nuclear weapon. And again, I mention this because I've seen government leaders in the United States, at least, describe that these threats are like, for example, our former national security advisor described them as, quote, like WMD, like a weapon of mass destruction. No, a nuclear bomb going off has very different consequences than the power grid going down. But so there's real risks, but we need to put them into consequence. Now, there haven't yet been, obviously enough, any hacking incidents that have actually taken down these systems, whether it's the overall power grid or nuclear plants in particular. That doesn't mean that they haven't been constantly attacked, and attacked for very different reasons. There's some people who are doing it simply to try and see if they can get on the inside. There's other people that are doing it to try and steal secrets. There's other people that don't have the skills that would like to take them down but can't. And then there's a final measure, which is nations doing what we would call preparing the battlefield. So for example, in 2013, Chinese hackers were discovered inside a number of American energy companies, not stealing secrets of how they might negotiate, but actually trying to understand the way the industrial control systems operate. It was basically a what if there was a US-China war, that they would have a capability to operate. No, by the way, the United States engages in similar kind of activities. So the point is, there's some actors out there who have capability. There's other actors who have capability but are deterred until there's an actual different level. So there's a difference between what a China or what the NSA could do versus what the Cyber Caliphate is a group that's been linked to ISIL, ISIS, Daesh. They don't have the same skill set. What can we do to prevent this? There's a whole series of things we need to do. One is obviously they need to remain sensitive to these threats. A big problem in the space of particularly energy companies is they depend a great deal on a particular class of technology called industrial control systems. And industrial control systems have been shown to be quite vulnerable if they're not constantly updated to certain new weapons that are out there. One, for example, being Stuxnet, or that class of weapon. And when I say industrial control systems, there's a software called SCADA that's used in everything from nuclear power plants to traffic lights to the engine rooms of ships. And so you can see the consequences if someone's able to go after that. So one is to be constantly vigilant, constantly sharing information. Some companies share well, others don't. That's the role of government, to ensure that they're sharing well on threats and with their peers in other nations, so that if one nation's hit by a certain class of threat, everyone else is finding out about it. And then finally is to question how much of your system are you linking online out of need versus convenience. This is particularly a problem for energy companies, where there is a lot of systems now that are linked online simply to make it easier for people to operate them, but it may be creating greater consequences, greater dangers. We could go into more detail, but that appears to be, for example, what happened to Saudi Aramco, where there was a lot of things that it did that made great sense, but also things that happened so that were seen as efficiency and convenience that actually created consequences for them.
سؤال آخر؟ تفضل.
Thank you very much. In the age of oversharing
الاسم لو سمحت تعرف عن نفسك بس.
شهاب الفهيم. Just a question about social media and the culture of oversharing, and it just brought me back to the idea of you telling your kids to cover their mouth before when they cough. So now it seems that everyone is just very open, and this is creating threats everywhere because of this culture of oversharing. So where does social media and the usage of it fall into cybersecurity?
It's a very interesting question, and it links to so many different topics on everything from how businesses operate to, again, how we've seen this new class of terror groups take off in large part because of social media. And in turn, it's given them, there's fears that they're using social media to gather information on who they might threaten. As an example, there was a list put out of 1,000 American soldiers and their email addresses and the like, and it seemed to have been gathered via social media. And so there's concern, could they go after their families? The challenge is, one, we need to distinguish between the use of social media and true hacking with consequence. So yes, ISIL, Daesh has been highly effective in its use of social media and recruiting and sharing information. It even went after the US military's Twitter feed and took it over for a couple hours. But that's very different than some of the high consequence, high risk things that we've seen. They're not in a class with what, for example, groups linked to Iran have been able to carry out, to what the National Security Agency have been able to carry out in terms of their hacking, in terms of getting inside closed networks, government networks, doing things of consequence. So we need to put that measure of being good in one area of social media and communicating doesn't necessarily mean you're good at the cybersecurity side of things. Second, as you put it, there is a culture, we would call it oversharing, younger generation would call it normal. It's just the way they operate right now. And I don't know if there's any way to go back on it other than to constantly remind them that these things have consequences and that what you put online, it is like, it's different than writing in pencil. It's writing in ink for the entire world to see forever. And things that you don't think will have consequence for you right now, 10, 15 years from now will, whether it's embarrassing things that you said or did as a youth. And I mean, this is gonna be, we're gonna see some very interesting things where 20 years from now, we will know everything that our national leaders did and said as teenagers. Think about that for a minute. All the embarrassing things they did or said, we'll know that about them because it'll be able to be mined and potentially used in positive and negative ways. If you've watched the news right now, though, it's not just a problem with young generation. The big hack the great thing about cybersecurity is there is always a new story. This one is, there is a site called Ashley Madison that is basically a site for people who wanted to cheat on their spouses would go to gather. It was hacked. Now, this is going to be very, and the information is all now online. It's going to be very embarrassing for a lot of individuals, but it actually has scary consequences because among the set of it, it was just revealed today, 10,000 US military soldiers were using this site. The reason we know that is because the email addresses ended in .mil, which is the US military one. So now you have 10,000 soldiers that, one, they're gonna have some problems with their wives when they get home, but two, when you combine that with the Chinese government hack of the Office of Personnel Management, you can now match things where you'll be able to know lots of information, including embarrassing information, and the realm of espionage and spying, that's how you affect people. That's how you make them do things they wouldn't otherwise. So the point is, it's not just the youth, it's also people today. All of us need to be sensitive to this. And again, it's not just what you intentionally are sharing on social media, it can also be unintentional things. Last point though, this can be very good in other ways. It can be very useful. So on one hand, we've seen terror groups use this information, use social media to share horrible videos of them doing horrible things, beheading people. But in turn, we've been able to look at those photos and figure out where their hideout is by the background. Or you're on social media, if I find you, then I can find the network of people that you're connected to. So some people want to knock these groups offline. Other people on the intelligence community side say, no, I want to be able to find them and find out who they're communicating with, and I can do this in an entire new way. It also finally points to a new realm of research, how people write books. For my book Ghost Fleet, one of the things that it covers is the next generation of weaponry, American weaponry, but also weaponry from nations like China. China doesn't willingly share things like what its next aircraft carrier will look like. But we were able to figure that out by what are called selfie photos, where Chinese citizens would take photos of themselves in a harbor, and in the background was the ship under construction. And then you could take the picture of the ship and marry it up to Google Earth and figure out the size of the ship, the size of the elevators in the ship, that then allows you to know what size airplane will be on the ship or not. All of it I can gather myself, which is something the CIA couldn't do 20 years ago. So again, we can view it as a danger. We can also view it as a tool for everything from researchers to militaries.
سؤال آخر. The back.
شكرا لمركز الإمارات.
Thank you for the ECSSR for this opportunity.
UAE National Defense College. Peter, just one question. That is, does the release of US government files by Edward Snowden, in the long run, will that lead to improved cybersecurity or worse cybersecurity?
You called him by name I was recently at the NSA, and we referred to him there as he that shalt not be named for the Harry Potter fans in the room. The consequences of Edward Snowden and the massive amount of documents that he revealed are enormous, and they're still reverberating, and you can measure them in lots of different ways. And in large part is because of the sheer scale of the files, well over 1.2 million, maybe more files. And they covered all sorts of different activities. And I classify the activities into 3 categories. There were activities that frankly were strategic, that made sense. He revealed that American spy agencies spy on American perceived enemies, that they went after terrorists, they went after other militaries. Surprise, not controversial, shouldn't be controversial. Second thing he revealed, though, were activities that we could call questionable, debatable. And this is where a large part of the mass surveillance debate is, where in pursuit of a small number, information on a small number of individuals, suspected terrorists, they monitored, gathered, however you want to describe it, information on literally tens of millions or arguably the world. And in so doing, raised questions of, for example, in the United States, it relates to constitutional questions and the like. So essentially, this is the questionable part of the debate. The third category I'm on record as calling unstrategic or stupid. These are activities where they targeted close American allies, where we may have gained certain amounts of information, but the risk of the activity was not worth it. So whatever you gained by going after Angela Merkel was not worth the broader consequences. Or to American business, they estimate that American technology companies have lost at least $40 billion worth of revenue because of these disclosures. So long-winded way of going through the consequences of this. On the cybersecurity side, I think the challenge of it you can measure in a couple of ways. It's made people more sensitive to cybersecurity. On the other hand, it disclosed a number of very useful activities by the NSA in going after perpetrators in this space. Now they've figured out workarounds. But I think my concern is really the third part, is the consequence that it's had on the global debate over the future of the internet, where a number of nations have used the excuse of the Snowden disclosures to chill internet freedom they've undertaken activities that have nothing to do with those disclosures, but they've basically said, see, this can't be trusted. And you can see this in everything from China's great internet firewall to Russia has a blacklist of websites that people can't go to. And they use counterterrorism legislation. To give you an example, Google was on them as a terrorist website. It's not. The point is that we've seen people use the excuse of the Snowden affair to pursue their own agendas, and I worry that it will leave the internet itself less open, less shared, which makes it actually not just less useful, but also less secure, because it's that openness that allows it to be kind of a living, breathing, constantly updating system.
آخر سؤال.
My name is, I'm Dr. Ali Lamoudi. I'm a senior environmental engineer. And I would like to thank you for the brilliant lecture, Dr. Singer. I have two concerns. As you know, that UAE has, a very good strategy in the sense of, technology and cyber control. And that's the networking, which is nowadays is attacking everywhere. So there is a good concern from our government here in UAE. Under the same pattern or the same concern, my first question is, what can we do, we as individuals, compared to the national strategy? What strategy you advise us? You advise the individual can control. Sometimes in your WhatsApp, for example, you find someone who sends you a message and says, don't open a link that comes to you and can, attack all your personal identities, your personal belongings and everything. This is one thing. The second question, do you think, Dr. Singer, that the time came where the tourists will give up the strategy of exploring a military base or a military or security area and convert to the cyber attack or the cyber crime strategy? Thank you.
So the challenge, in many ways, I go back to some of the measures that UAE should be thinking as a nation also apply all the way down to the individual. And overall, it's the concept of resilience. It's essentially trying to make the job of the inevitable attacker as hard as it is possible, but also acknowledging that there will inevitably be attacks, and inevitably some of them might even succeed. And that's a very different approach, both for us as individuals and as nations, because particularly this is a space that links back to the military side, so we think in terms of offense and defense. Offense, I will be so good at hitting you that you will be scared, you will be deterred from attacking me, or defense, I will be so good that I will keep you out. These are very classic approaches of both the military, but also when we think about our homes. I'll lock my doors, I'll build high walls. Resilience is instead accepting that. And again, I can talk about the national side, but on the personal side, it's sometimes there's measures that we can do to put into place to make the job of attackers hard. So I'll just focus on one little area. I made the joke about passwords. It's a very real problem. It's both in terms of the complexity of passwords, and sometimes people say, well, how can I remember really complex passwords? That's why I use password, or that's why, to go back to the question about socialing, don't use as a password things that are easy to find out about you on social networks. So don't use your first child's name, because I can go on Facebook and find that out quite easily. Don't make the job of the attacker easy. So what can we do instead? How do we build a complex algorithm? Well, that most importantly, we as humans can remember. One simple measure that was taught to me by a cryptologist, is think of your favorite saying, your favorite song, whatever it is, and then take the first or the last letter from every word in that. So, happy birthday to you, HB2Y. Now everyone don't go use that one. But the point is, you just created something far more complex, but easy for you to remember than password or your child's name. Another key challenge, though, don't use the same password across different areas, because different organizations that you share information with have different levels of security. So your bank will most likely have very good security versus, say, I love sports, and so I play what are called fantasy sports, where I track my sports teams and I have a password. Well, the sports network is not protecting my information the same way my bank is. But if I'm lazy, I'm using the same password on both, and hackers are smart. They go after the lesser defended place, knowing that you're likely to use it in other places. So this is an example of kind of the password side. But a different example with resilience is the concept of, if you can't bear to lose something, prepare to lose it. Backups and the like. And that applies to whether you're thinking about your important documents, your personal identifiers, to them in the real world. Why not backups for them in the other world? Again, these are very simple measures. None of them, though, will solve all the problems, but it's just about making yourself a more resilient target so that the consequences of it are not as high when the attack inevitably happens.
في نهاية هذه المحاضرة